Welcome to Structure and Function of the Digestive System. Let's start with an overview of the GI tract. So we have, starting at the top, the mouth, the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, the large intestine, the rectum, and the anus. And we'll also be discussing some accessory organs of digestion a little later in the lecture. So just a broad overview of each one. The mouth is where digestion begins. This is where mechanical breakdown of food begins, and also the chemical process of digestion begins with saliva and with the enzymes amylase in there, which start breaking down starch into sugars. So if you ever chew a cracker for a really, really long time, you'll kind of notice how you start to have a sweet flavor in your mouth. And so that is that amylase in action. Then we have the esophagus, which is that long food tube that transports food from the mouth to the stomach. And this moves the food along through muscle contractions called peristalsis. So no digestion occurs there, only movement. Then we have the stomach, and the function of the stomach is a storage and mixing chamber. And this is where all that hydrochloric acid comes in, as well as the enzyme pepsin. And so this is where protein digestion starts. And it's also when food gets mixed with gastric juices and it becomes something called chyme. And that is spelled CHYME. That is a semi-liquid mixture. And most bacteria are killed here. And like I said, that's where the digestion of proteins begins. The small intestine is the main site of digestion and absorption, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in later slides. The large intestine, I'm just going to come right out and say this is where poop is formed. This is where water is absorbed and electrolytes are absorbed from any remaining indigestible food. And it's also where some important vitamins are produced. The rectum is where feces is stored until it's ready to come out of the body. And then the anus is the exit point for waste materials. So here is a picture from beginning to end of where digestion starts with the mouth all the way to the rectum. So the GI tract just has a lot of functions that I briefly went through. But this is where food is ingested, mechanical and chemical digestion happen, and elimination occurs. And then also the GI tract is an important site for um, the immune and microbial protection. I'm sure some of you have read somewhat about the importance of the microbiome, especially if you are aware of antibiotics and some of the cautions we need to take around them. That is because the GI tract has this immune and microbial protective function. Here is so to go into a little more depth, there are layers. There's the mucosa, that's the innermost layer. And that is going to be the layer that comes into direct contact with chyme or the food inside the digestive tract. And then that is subdivided into the epithelial layer, which secretes the mucus, enzymes, and hormones. The lamina propria, I'm sure my pronunciation isn't great, is a layer of connective tissue containing blood and lymph vessels for nutrient absorption. The muscularis mucosa is a thin layer of muscle that helps move the mucosa and increase contact with the food. And this just helps that food come into contact with the lining so that digestion can happen, so those digestive enzymes can be secreted and nutrients can be absorbed. The submucosa is just beneath the mucosa, and it's a connective tissue layer. And that is where all the blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and nerves, so the submucosal or Meissner's plexus is. This provides support and elasticity. This provides the blood flow for nutrients to be transported. And it contains the nerves that actually control those secretions and movement of the mucosa. The muscularis externa is a thick layer of smooth muscle that is responsible for moving food through the GI tract. And it contains the myenteric nerve plexus, which coordinates muscle contractions. The serosa is the outermost covering of the GI tract, and it's very slippery. And its purpose is to reduce friction between the organs. So it's part of what we call the visceral peritoneum. In the esophagus and the rectum, it's called the adventitia. So it has a protective function and it anchors the GI tract. The GI tract is controlled by local, so a nervous system that is like contained within the GI tract, but also the autonomic nervous system. And here's a picture that kind of shows that out in picture, like displays that in picture form. So you can have a look at that. We have salivary glands. We have three pairs. We have submandibular, sublingual, and parotid. And we secrete about 1 liter of saliva per day. Wow, that's a lot. So here's a picture of where those are located. And saliva is water mixed with mucus, sodium, bicarbonate, chloride, potassium, and salivary alpha amylase, which is what I was referring to earlier, which helps break down food into sugars. And salivary glands are controlled by sympathetic and parasympathetic fibers. The act of swallowing, so it starts in the mouth and the esophagus and kind of starts that process of peristalsis. Now, peristalsis is a wave-like action. It's coordinated, it's sequential, and it is contraction, relaxation of outer, longitudinal, and inner circular layers of muscles. We have an upper esophageal sphincter, as you see in that diagram, and we have a lower esophageal sphincter, which is right there by the stomach. And the function of the upper esophageal sphincter is to keep air from entering the esophagus during breathing. And the lower esophageal sphincter prevents regurgitation from the stomach because the stomach contains a lot of acid and we don't want that acid splashing up. But sometimes it does. And maybe you've experienced that or you've known people who have. So maybe their lower esophageal sphincter is not functioning very well, and that can lead to pain and all kinds of problems. So we have phases of swallowing. We have the oropharyngeal phase, which is voluntary. So this is when we chew our food, it gets formed into a bolus, and we swallow it down, it goes to the pharynx. The pharynx contracts. We don't breathe while we're swallowing. And then that epiglottis opens up, it slides down, and that food enters the esophagus. And then that is when the involuntary part begins. The esophagus relaxes, and that wave-like action, that peristalsis occurs to move the food down lower to the lower esophageal sphincter. And then that food bolus enters the stomach. The stomach is made up of some different areas. We have the functional areas, which are the fundus, the body, and the antrum. And the boundaries of the stomach are the cardiac orifice, the pyloric sphincter, and the pylorus. The stomach is made up of three layers of muscle. We have the longitudinal outer layer, the circular middle layer, and the oblique inner layer. The interior is lined with mucosa, and that is very protective because, like I said, it is very acidic in the stomach. When the stomach is empty, that mucosal layer will be in folds called rugae. And the stomach gets its supply from the celiac artery. So here's a picture. It's hollow, it's muscular, it's just below our diaphragm. And once again, this is where food is mixed with gastric juices and digestive juices are secreted. And the stomach stores food as well. Gastric motility refers to swallowing, which causes the relaxation. And that is facilitated by hormones called gastrin and cholecystokinin. Motilin increases peristalsis and secretin decreases peristalsis. So these are both hormones that are produced in the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine, and that regulates digestion. Gastric mixing and emptying is part of gastric motility. And the rate of motility, it's dependent on the volume of what's being digested, on osmotic pressure, and just the chemical composition of what's there. Gastric secretion is stimulated by eating. So that is something that it starts, the second that we even start thinking about food. Maybe you've experienced that. You're thinking about something really delicious you're going to eat. You will start that gastric secretion process. So it begins in what's called a cephalic phase. So that is when sensory stimuli, so the sight, smell, taste of food activate the vagus nerve. And then that moves into the gastric phase after we start eating. The food in the stomach stretches the walls of the stomach and activates receptors, and then those pathways increase acetylcholine and gastrin is produced. Now, gastrin is released by G cells in the stomach. It's specifically stimulated by proteins in food, but also by stomach distension and the vagal nerve action. Gastrin increases production of hydrochloric acid by the parietal cells, and it's going to promote that gastric motility, and it's going to enhance the secretion of something called pepsinogen, which we'll talk about shortly. Gastrin is like the major thing that drives acid secretion during digestion. So paracrine pathways, this is a kind of signaling from cell to cell in the stomach. Let's see. This is like a local type of communication. So histamine is actually released, which boosts acid secretion. So sometimes people will get antihistamines for or histamine blockers. I believe one of the common digestive over-the-counter medications is a histamine blocker. And the name's not coming to me right now, but when we think histamine, I think a lot of people think antihistamine as far as like putting cream on a bug bite, but we have histamine release in our stomachs too, and that once again boosts acid secretion. The function of acetylcholine is to stimulate those parietal cells to secrete acid. It also links the nervous system to gastric function. And then certain chemicals will stimulate gastric secretion. So alcohol, coffee, and protein. So, coffee and alcohol, they're very irritating to the stomach. And I'm sure some of you have experienced how they increase acid production in the stomach. So that's responsible for some of those unpleasant effects. So notably, coffee will stimulate parietal cells to produce more acid, even if it's caffeine free. And then alcohol increases the gastric acid secretion and pepsin secretion. And this is a process that happens completely independently of any neural pathway. And then the amino acids that make up protein will uh, trigger gastrin release because they need to be broken down. Here's a little diagram of gastric secretion, some of those cells that I was referring to. That's where they live within the stomach. Um, So we talked about how acid is secreted. We've talked about gastrin a little bit. We haven't said much about intrinsic factor, so I want to speak to that for a minute. It is also secreted by parietal cells, and its major function is binding vitamin B12 so that it can be absorbed in the ileum. So if you ever have known anyone who is low on B12, it could be because they lack intrinsic factor. And people who lack intrinsic factor, they can't just take an over-the-counter B12, and it's why a lot of B12 that they're probably getting through their diets is not actually helping them because it's not getting absorbed in their stomach because they don't have the intrinsic factor. Gastropherin is something that binds dietary iron and it enhances the absorption of iron. So, a lot of the vitamins and nutrients that we depend on for our health, it's not enough that we just ingest them through eating. We have to have these things active and healthy in our GI system to be able to actually absorb them. To talk about pepsin a bit for a minute, pepsin is the activated form from pepsinogen and it assists in protein breakdown. Um, I want to say, hold on. Oh, I want to talk a little bit more about pepsin. Let me go to the next slide. So pepsin is um, the active form of pepsinogen. We call that an inactive precursor. So stomach acid activates that pepsinogen, and then pepsin begins protein digestion into pepsides. The inactive form of pepsin, so pepsinogen, also is super important because it prevents autodigestion, and autodigestion means it literally keeps the stomach from eating itself because there are so many enzymes in just this very strong acid. So we have a bunch of hydrochloric acid in our stomachs. It creates a very low pH to help denature proteins, so break them down. And that activates the pepsinogen, as I was saying, but it also provides bactericidal protection against ingested pathogens. So if we didn't have this super acidic um, hydrochloric acid in our stomach, we would be a lot sicker because we probably eat, not to be gross, but we probably eat things that are not so great for us all the time. And it's by virtue of our stomach acid that we don't get very sick. When I was looking up pictures to make this presentation, I kept seeing this picture of stomach acid dissolving a razor blade. And I'm not sure how real that is. Please don't experiment with this. But from what I was reading, the metal of a razor blade, it will make it very, very brittle within 24 hours. So, acid's also important because it helps facilitate the absorption of minerals like iron and calcium. Then we have mucus. So, mucus is secreted by the mucosal surface and neck cells. Um, It forms a protective barrier on that gastric epithelium, and you do need some protection because of all that acid. It protects the stomach lining from being damaged by the acid and digestive enzymes, and it contains bicarbonate to neutralize the acid at the surface of the mucosa. So if we didn't have that mucosal layer, or if the mucosal layer gets damaged, then peptic ulcers can form. Moving on to the small intestine, it is 5 to 6 meters long, so it can be up to about 20 feet long, and it's divided into three segments: the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. And then we have an ileocecal valve. Here's a picture of the small intestine. To go through from the top, well, an overview, the small intestine is, as I said earlier, is where digestion and nutrient absorption primarily occur. So that's the primary site of that. And it starts from the pyloric sphincter of the stomach, and it goes all the way to the ileocecal valve, which leads to the large intestine. Let's start with the duodenum. So the duodenum is the first and the shortest segment. There's a C-shaped curve that goes around the head of the pancreas, and it takes that chyme, which is that partially digested food from the stomach, and it gets bile and liver from the liver and the gallbladder, and digestive enzymes from the pancreas. And the function and purpose of that duodenal section is to neutralize the acidic chyme through the bicarbonate, the chemical digestion of fats, proteins, and carbohydrates occurs there. And then also the regulatory hormones such as secretin and CCK, they help modulate the gastric emptying and enzyme secretion. So then moving on to the jejunum, that is the middle portion. That's about 2.5 meters long. So I think that's a little over 6 feet. There's thicker walls in this section, and there's a richer blood supply. This is the major site of nutrient absorption. So this is where carbohydrates, amino acid, and vitamins and minerals are going to be absorbed. And I would definitely make sure that you remember which part of the small intestine does what, and just kind of the general function of each part as I'm talking through them. Um, and then, oh, before we move on to the ileum, so nutrients are primarily absorbed in the jejunum, specifically carbohydrates, amino acid, and most vitamins and minerals. And there are a lot of capillary networks in this area, and that is so as soon as those nutrients are absorbed, they can be whisked away through the bloodstream to where they need to be in the body. Then we have the ileum, and this is the final and longest portion, and that's about 3.5 meters, so about 8 or 9 feet roughly. It contains something called Peyer's patches, which is that immune tissue I was talking a little bit about, and it ends at the ileocecal valve. And its purpose is to absorb vitamin B12, bile salts, and any remaining nutrients before we move down to the large intestine. This is where we have immunologic surveillance. So kind of like little security guards. You could think of them that are watching out for pathogens. And the ileocecal valve, like any valve, it prevents backflow. So it keeps things moving forward into the large intestine. And just another thing about the small intestine, the absorption that occurs happens through something called villi. And there are some little subdivisions of villi, but they are basically these little tiny, like finger-like projections that help absorption. Here is this little chart of gastrointestinal absorption, and I think it's pretty fascinating. It shows what gets absorbed where. So you can see if you drink alcohol, 20% of the absorption happens in the stomach. And, maybe that has to do with why eating kind of influences how you feel, or influences how impaired you get. If you make the mistake of drinking on an empty stomach, you're going to feel it because 20% of alcohol is absorbed in the stomach. And you can kind of see it listed where each nutrient and vitamin are absorbed. It's just, I don't know, it's a fascinating chart to me. So moving on down to the large intestine, this starts after the ileocecal valve. We have something called haustra. We don't have villi anymore. We have haustra, and these are sac-like segments, and they contract to move feces. And then we have mucosa with goblet cells, which produce mucus for lubrication and protection. We have a very, very vast bacterial population, and that is for our health. So once again, the large intestine doesn't have villi, and that's because once things have moved down to the large intestine, we're not absorbing nutrients anymore. So we don't need all that absorptive surface that the villi provide. The primary function of the large intestine is water and electrolyte absorption. So this is where the body grabs water, sodium, and potassium, so that we don't get dehydrated and we don't have electrolyte imbalance. So when people have diarrhea, that function is not occurring. And so that can lead to problems like not having enough water and not having enough potassium. We call that hypokalemia. So this is where feces are formed and transported, all that indigestible material that the body couldn't use, and the bacteria get formed into stool. And then mucus lubricates the intestine so that the poop doesn't injure our body as it's passing. And then huge waves of peristalsis move stool toward the rectum. So this is where bacteria becomes really important. This is the area of the body. The gut bacteria, they have a job in breaking down whatever carbs and fiber remain. And this is where gases are formed, not to be gross, but I mean, there's just no way of talking about the large intestine without talking about gas and poop. So we have some important vitamins. Vitamin K, which is very important to our blood clotting, and we have biotin and folate. And there is an immune function here as well. This is where our microbiome is really important because they basically compete with pathogens. So if we have a good microbiome, if we have a good collection of bacteria, then they're going to quash any pathogens that are there. So you can see that little appendix on the left. So when we're talking about appendicitis, that's that little part that we're talking about. The appendix actually has a little bit of a role in immune surveillance. It's not completely unnecessary. And then we have mucosal cells that form a physical and immune barrier for those pathogens. When that stool has been compacted and that process has occurred, then peristalsis will kind of move the stool down, the rectum will store it, and then once someone gets that signal to go, we have, well, the internal anal sphincter operates under involuntary control. So basically the stool pushes down and that sphincter opens up, but the external ankle sphincter operates under voluntary control. So that prevents you from having, an embarrassing accident. So, a little more about immunity and the GI system. We have gut-associated lymphoid tissue, and its major role is killing a lot of microorganisms. Our mucosal secretions also produce IgA antibodies, and we have Paneth cells, which produce defensins and other antibiotic peptides, and lysosomes that are important to mucosal immunity. The Pire patches that I was talking about are collections of lymphocytes, plasma cells, and macrophages. So they produce the IgA as a component of that gut-associated lymphoid tissue, and that happens in the small intestine. Um, the intestinal microbiome, so it's highest in the colon, that large intestine, as I was just saying. Your bacterial flora is really dependent on, number one, your genetics. Some of it's kind of out of your control, but it's also dependent on your diet, on the environment you live in. It's, dependent on medications or drugs that you may be taking. And it has a huge role in alerting the immune system, protect against infection. And if this is something you're interested in, I would recommend reading about it because it's pretty fascinating all the ways that they think that we're influenced by this. So the intestinal microbiome, it's the intestinal tract, it's sterile at birth, but it gets colonized within a few hours. So this is why babies, we have to be pretty careful, like what we feed them and when, and why they don't eat solid food for, in minimum, the first 4 months of their life, because they need time to develop this intestinal microbiome. But, it starts colonizing pretty fast as they get older. The diversity of bacteria um, will increase for a while, but as we age, the number and diversity of bacteria decrease. Um, in the actual stomach, there's not much bacteria at all. So in the stomach, acid is what kills pathogens. Um, there's a low concentration of aerobes in the duodenum and jejunum. Um, it's suppressed by acid, intestinal motility, and antibodies. There are anaerobes that are distal to the ileocecal valve, but they're not proximal to the ileum. And then just a word about splenic blood flow. This provides blood flow to the esophagus, the stomach, the small and large intestine, the liver, the gallbladder, the pancreas, the spleen, and it's an important reservoir of blood volume. The accessory organs of digestion, we have the liver, the gallbladder, and the exocrine pancreas, and their broad purpose is to secrete substances necessary for digestion. Um, let's start with this picture that kind of shows them listed out, and you can see that the liver is just huge. That is in the right upper quadrant of your abdomen. And you can see the gallbladder is that little organ kind of hanging off under the liver. It's a little behind it. The pancreas kind of looks like a corn cob to me. It's located right behind the stomach. When people are having pancreatic pain, they typically have pain right behind their belly button. I'll just say that. Let's start with the liver. Here is a picture of it. There's one picture of it anyway. And the liver is the largest internal organ, and it's a very important component of the GI system because it is important for metabolism, detoxification, and producing bile. So if you ever look up drug information, which I hope you will, because you're in nursing school, a lot of it will talk about hepatic metabolism. So a lot of drugs are metabolized in the liver. Um, we have a hepatic artery, which supplies oxygen-rich blood. We have a hepatic portal vein, which is nutrient-rich blood that comes from the small intestine. And the liver processes that blood before it's returned to the systemic circulation. So we have a right and left lobe plus what's called a quadrate and a caudate. And we have a large surface area for the metabolic tasks that have to take place. The lobules are functional units of the liver, and they're made of hepatocytes. And this is where nutrients are processed and bile is made. Hepatocytes are the primary liver cells. They produce bile, they do the detox and metabolism. Then we have portal triads, which are branches of the bile duct, the hepatic artery, and the portal vein at each lobule. And they connect digestion derived nutrients to the hepatocyte. And then we have bile ducts that drain into the gallbladder or the duodenum, which are really important for fat digestion. So the liver's major digestive jobs are producing bile. Um, and bile contains bile salts, bilirubin, and cholesterol. They emulsify dietary fats, so they break big old lumps of fat into smaller droplets. And they also enhance fat absorption. And this is very important for fat soluble vitamins, which are A, D, E, and K. So if we don't have bile, then we can't absorb fat, and that is going to lead to steatorrhea, which is poop with a bunch of fat in it, and being very vitamin deficient. Um, Also, the liver has a role in carbohydrates, proteins as well. If you remember back to our diabetes lecture, converts glucose to glycogen. It plays a role in glucose regulation, and that helps us ensure that we have a steady energy supply. Um, Plasma proteins are produced via albumin and clotting factors. The liver converts ammonia to urea, and it prevents toxic ammonia buildup. So if you haven't seen it already, soon you'll go to clinical, and I guarantee you will see people who have problems with their liver. And oftentimes, they are very confused and they're very sick because they have too much ammonia in their body. And that is because their liver is not converting that ammonia to urea. Um, so cholesterol and lipoproteins are synthesized here. Basically, all cell membranes and hormone production is supported by the liver. Glycogen is stored in the liver. Fat soluble vitamins, A, D, E, and K, vitamin B12, as well as iron and copper. So, like I said, the liver is crucial for removing drugs, alcohol, and toxins from the body. It filters old red blood cells. It converts bilirubin, which comes from the breakdown of RBCs, so that it can be excreted in bile. And if bilirubin can't be excreted properly, you get what's called jaundice. So once again, that's why people with liver problems often have a yellowy appearance because the bilirubin is not being excreted as it should. The liver has a little role in immune defense. There's something called Kupffer cells, which destroy pathogens in old blood cells, and it protects the body from microbes entering from the GI tract. Here is a little picture of hepatic portal circulation. So sometimes you hear of people having with liver problems or cirrhosis, hepatic like portal hypertension. So that means their pressure there is very high, and that's different than having the hypertension we've talked about before. Here's just a little flow chart of enterohepatic circulation for you to take a look at. And here is the gallbladder. You know, maybe some of you have had your gallbladder removed. The gallbladder has an important function, and sometimes people talk about an appendix being removed and a gallbladder being removed as the same kind of category of surgery in terms of the effect, but you can really feel it in your digestive system. So I've heard and seen if your gallbladder is removed. And like I was saying before, it's tucked under the liver. There's a smooth muscle layer for contraction. There is mucosa with folds to allow expansion. We don't have a thick submucosa, so it's more susceptible to inflammation if it gets obstructed. So the function of the gallbladder is to produce bile, and that helps emulsify fats, which makes it easier for pancreatic lipase to digest them. So that helps with absorbing the fat-soluble vitamins, and it helps with eliminating bilirubin and cholesterol from the body. So if we don't have the gallbladder delivering bile to the intestine, then we can't digest fat very well. And then finally, we have the exocrine pancreas. So we talked about the endocrine pancreas when we talked about diabetes, but the exocrine pancreas is actually what makes up most pancreatic tissue, which is about 85 to 90%. We have acinar cells, which are little clustered grape-like cells, and they secrete digestive enzymes. We have ductal cells, which line the pancreatic ducts, and they secrete water and bicarb to neutralize gastric acid. And we have pancreatic ducts, which transport enzyme-rich fluid to the small intestine. So the exocrine pancreas produces some enzymes. So protease is involved with protein digestion. And also, proteases are released in an inactive form, and that is to prevent autodigestion. And that's going to come up again when we talk about pancreatitis, because if we don't have protease in its correct form, then the pancreas is literally going to start eating itself, and that's very painful. Pancreatic amylase is important for carbohydrate digestion, and lipase is important for fat digestion, and nuclease is important for DNase, RNase, nucleic acid digestion. The ductal cells secrete the bicarb to neutralize acid. We don't want it entering the duodenum from the stomach. It provides optimal pH for the pancreatic enzymes, and it protects that intestinal mucosa. So that is the end of my lecture. I know that I said a lot, and a lot of it seems kind of dense, but try to know the general purpose of each organ and structure I talked about. Try to understand each portion of the small intestine, and understand the role of the large intestine, the stomach, what parts of digestion happen where. As always, reach out to me with any questions, and have a great day.